Everybody lives and everybody dies, but some of the most famous people to ever die did it in a really weird way. You don't have to be famous to die in a weird or mysterious way, but these people were really famous and everybody's still scratching their heads about their death. First on our list, Steve Irwin. Steve Irwin was an idol to anybody of the millennial generation who also loved animals. This is a man who was famous in the 1990s for several television shows. Steve Irwin grew up around crocodiles his entire life, all sorts of reptiles. He inherited this love from his dad, Bob. The Crocodile Hunter was probably his most famous show. He was the host, his wife Terry was the co-host, and they also hosted Croc Files, the Crocodile Hunter Diaries, and some other shows as well. He was also co-owner of the Australia Zoo in Queensland, Australia. And if you had to ask anybody how is Steve Irwin going to die if it was at the hands of an animal or Paws or in this case Barb, most people would probably say a crocodile or a venomous snake. But it turns out in 2006, September, he was swimming in the ocean. He was trying to film a documentary that was a complete underwater documentary about sea life when he was filming some stingrays. He was over top of one of them in the ocean. The stingray stuck his barb straight into Steve Irwin's chest, piercing his heart, and that was it. He became unconscious almost immediately. The crew on the boat tried to revive him, but unfortunately, he was pronounced dead when he arrived at the hospital. Steve Irwin has a lasting legacy. It is an understatement to say something like that. I have a tattoo of the guy's face on my leg. If it wasn't for Steve Irwin, there wouldn't be this channel or the one that started this channel and so many more people in the animal industry. We all have Steve Irwin to thank. In the 70s and 80s, Motown was very popular, dating back until the 60s, and there was only one Prince of Motown, Marvin Gaye. Some of the most famous music of all time. Marvin Gaye was everywhere. In fact, his last television performance was singing the Star-Spangled Banner at the NBA All-Star Game. Marvin had an illustrious career and he was entering the last part of his 40s, and in fact, the day before his 45th birthday, his life came to an end. Marvin Gaye, who was born in DC, moved to Los Angeles, as you do when you're a famous singer, and he lived with his father, Marvin Gaye Sr. Marvin Gaye Sr. was a church minister. But on April 1st, 1984, Sr. and Jr. were in the middle of a heated argument. Sr. left the room and came back with a gift that Marvin Jr. had given him years earlier. In Sr.'s hand was a gun, a handgun. He unloaded the handgun into his son, and that was it. Marvin Gaye was dead. Later on, Sr. decided he was going to plead no contest to manslaughter, and he did 6 years in prison. After his death, Gaye was awarded tons of honors, including a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award, induction to the Rhythm and Blues Music Hall of Fame, and the Songwriters Hall of Fame, and the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. There was really very few people as big as Marvin Gaye at the time. Bob Crane is a name you maybe don't know, but you definitely know of the show Hogan's Heroes, of which Bob Crane was one of the stars of the 1970s sitcom. Well, 1965 to 1971. And at the time, Bob Crane was larger than life. He couldn't go anywhere without being recognized. Everybody knew who he was. But unfortunately, after Hogan's Heroes was canceled in 1971, his career also became almost canceled. His fame started to decline and he had a few extra roles, but didn't really see the success like he did in the sitcom up until 1971. His biggest claim to fame after the fact was performing in dinner theater, a very steep drop off to his fame before. Bob Crane also liked to film himself doing intimate things with women. See, back in the day, it was really expensive to buy recording equipment and you had to get a guy, and he had a guy who was then later charged with his murder but got off. Basically, Bob Crane liked to film himself and women in the bedroom. And in June 1978, in Scottsdale, Arizona, his body was found, alone in his apartment. He was bludgeoned to death. Later, people thought it was a tripod and he had a rope around his neck. There was many speculations of who did it, why they did it, but it always comes back to the fact he was probably filming all these encounters with women without their knowledge. Or it could have been a falling out with his partner at the time, but either way, nobody was actually sentenced for for the murder of Bob Crane. Brandon Lee was the son of Bruce Lee, both very famous and both had very mysterious deaths. Bruce died when Brandon was a young boy, but Brandon decided he was going to follow in his father's footsteps. He became a martial artist, and a very good one at that, and then in the 1980s and early 1990s, he started to rise to fame, finally getting himself a role in an A-list movie. And in the early 90s, he started to film the movie The Crow, which you can still watch today, and he still has part in, because he filmed almost all of his scenes. But on March 31st, 1993, Brandon Lee was filming a scene, and in the scene, his character is shot and killed by thugs. In the scene, Lee's character walks into an apartment and discovers his fiancée being beaten and assaulted. The thug then is supposed to fire a Smith & Wesson Model 629 chambered in .44 Magnum at Lee's character as he walks into the room. The issue is they used a real revolver. They were using dummy rounds though. Basically, quick lesson, a bullet goes into a cartridge. Inside the cartridge is a charge, and at the end is a primer. Hammer or firing pin strikes the primer, ignites the charge, and then projects the projectile, the actual bullet. Or inside a casing, not a cartridge. The whole thing is a cartridge. Either way, what they did to make it safe is they took the charge out, left the projectile in, and left the primer in. And the idea was they wanted to make it look realistic for the up-close shots. They did this scene multiple times with these rounds, but later on they decided to use a different type of round that did have a primer and a charge but didn't have a projectile. So the first set had projectiles but no charge. Now they have a charge and a primer but no projectile, which means that if a projectile is stuck in the barrel of the gun, now you have basically an entire cartridge. The primer goes off, ignites the charge, and anything that's stuck inside of the revolver barrel is going to go flying forward just like it's a real round. And that is exactly what happens. He is shot not at point blank range, but pretty close, within 3 or 4 meters. The bang goes off, nobody really realizes what had happened, and instead of falling forward like the scene entails, Brandon falls backwards. He starts to breathe heavily, everybody thinks it's a prank, and once they check on him, they still don't realize the projectile is lodged inside of his torso. They find a pulse on Brandon, they send him to a hospital, but they do 6 hours of emergency surgery, but in the end, Brandon Lee dies at the hospital. Now, of course, anybody who has any knowledge of firearms whatsoever knows how absolutely moronic this entire series of events were, and that's why there's so many conspiracies that maybe it really wasn't an accident after all. How could you be so stupid to make this silly mistake? But I guess we just did see very recently that this happened again. Furthermore, Bruce died in mysterious circumstances years earlier as well. He had some health problems earlier on in the year, and then he had a nap one day, didn't show up to set. Somebody found him dead, presumably while sleeping. He was rushed to the hospital, and he was dead on arrival. This is mysterious circumstances. He was only 32 years old, and it's suspected that maybe he had something to do with the Triad Gang. Britney Murphy was a very popular actress in the 2000s. Known for many roles, but especially the one in 8 Mile just before her death only a few years before. A healthy woman in her 30s, you'd never expect that she would die young, but at 8 a.m. on December 20th, 2009, the Los Angeles Fire Department responded to a medical request at the Los Angeles home of Britney Murphy. Apparently, she had collapsed, and firefighters had attempted to resuscitate her, and after she was transported to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, she died at 10:04 a.m. It is stated that she went into cardiac arrest, which is really weird for a woman who didn't have any illegal substances in her body, and she was only 32 years old. But upon medical examination, her autopsy did show that there were some drugs in her system, but all of them were over the counter. It's suspected that she was sick at the time and she was taking a bunch of medication to make herself feel better, as any normal person would. The report states the possible adverse psychological effects of elevated levels of these medications cannot be discounted, especially in her weakened state. So the official report is that she died naturally, or due to these medications that were over-the-counter medications and just weakened her to the point where she collapsed and had a cardiac arrest. But some people think this is really weird because normally cough and cold medication don't make 32-year-olds have heart attacks. Lastly, Natalie Wood is a name you definitely know if you were around in the 1970s and 80s to watch movies. She started appearing in films in the 40s when she was a young child, all the way until 1981 when she died. On November 29th, 1981, Natalie Wood was on a mega yacht with her husband and Christopher Walken. She was 43 years old at the time, and she was on the boat trip to Santa Catalina Island before her body was found, apparently drowned.
Have you ever murdered anyone, dude?
Only Natalie Wood.
I thought that was Christopher Walken.
He helped.
Other than the fact that she drowned, a lot of the other circumstances were a little wishy-washy. For example, it was never determined how she even entered the water in the first place, and her body, which was discovered at 8 a.m. on November 29th, was only 1 mile away from the boat. And there was a dinghy, one of those life rafts that are pretty common on a yacht, but the problem was she was terrified of water. Her family said she would never enter that dinghy alone. Her autopsy showed that there was drugs and alcohol in her system, but at the end of the day, if you're terrified of water, you're probably not going to get on a boat, even if she did have a fight with her husband, as reported. Nobody knows what happened. Nobody went to jail. Let me know in the comments section below what you think the most mysterious death of a celebrity is. As always, please hit the like and subscribe button. And because we do videos every weekend, that means I'll see you in the next one.